Hello world, my name is Ihor and this is another music production recipe. And today we're going to be focusing on making the bassline. Yes, bassline again. And I cannot stress enough how bassline important is, especially in the genres of minimal techno or IDM or downtempo or electronica. Basically in any genre which is synth heavy, the bassline plays an extremely critical role. And if you nail down the bassline properly, if it has a groove, if it's beefy and all this stuff, if it makes people dance, then you're pretty much done. Arrange the track, put drums on it, and yeah, good to go. With this in mind, I would like to make a patch from scratch on my modular over here, focusing on making the bassline. We're gonna start with some basics, and then I would like to take this bassline a couple of steps further to more advanced territory. So when it comes to the setup today, it's quite straightforward. We have the Digitakt over here as the main brain and a drum machine. I have the drum groove prepared over here. And then it sends the MIDI and MIDI clock into the modular, into this MIDI to CV converter. And then the audio goes back from the modular into the Digitakt. And from the Digitakt, we record everything in Ableton. I was asked a couple of times in the comments on my YouTube channel whether I sequence other synthesizers or my modular from the Digitakt MIDI sequencer. And the short answer is yes, but the longer answer is not that often. And not that often perhaps because I like utilizing Eurorack sequencers, because they immediately push you into more experimental territory, which I really like. However, the Digitakt MIDI sequencer is also quite powerful. It's not maybe too experimental. You kind of have to know where you're going, but it's really powerful. While the Eurorack sequencers, they can push you so hard into exploration, like numeric repetitor, for example. You can check this video over here that I did the other day, and it's crazy how immediate this sequencer is. But today, I would like to sequence the modular from the Digitakt, which also allowed me to free up some space on the 3U row over here. And to sequence your modular from the Digitakt or from any other MIDI sequencer, you just need to have the MIDI to CV converter, which is, for my case, is MIDI 1U module from Intelligible. Anyways, the rest of the modules here, we have the Quadrax for our envelopes, Dixie is our oscillator today, Bifold is going to play an interesting role. It's a folder with 2 channels and crossfader in between. I'm going to cover this a little bit later. Then we have Belgrade, amazing 2-pole filter. I really like it. It's going to be our low-pass filter, Polaris as the phaser, then Mesor is our compressor. Then we have Steppy over here and the dual VCA. And that's pretty much it. Let's start patching actually. And I would like to start with some really basic patch. So we're gonna go with these little cables, gonna grab the pulse wave from the Dixie into the input P of Bifold. And input P is set into like dry signal, no folding whatsoever. And then mix goes from the Bifold into the input of Belgrade, and from output of Belgrade into the phaser, from the phaser into the VCA. Such a coincidence that it happened to be over here, right? And then from the VCA, output from the VCA goes into the Mesor. And then from the Mesor, the compressed signal is going to go into output and into the Digitakt. Now, we also have to patch the MIDI stuff. So I'm going to grab the gate from the MIDI and go into trigger number 1 of Quadrax, and then pitch from the MIDI into 1 volt per octave of the Dixie. And last thing for this basic patch, and to utilize the first envelope from Quadrax as our VCA envelope. And now if I go into track 9, it's our MIDI track. I'm going to go into the source page and enable the channel. We can basically select any channel over here. Let's go with 4. Then we click learn over here and we just trigger once. And we got our sound going, right? It's a little bit too much right now, too loud, but we can work on it a little bit more. So, and I also able to play chromatically now. But for sake of making bassline, the next step would be to make a filter envelope. And it's quite easy. We're going to grab output 2 from the quadrats and go into the FM of Belgrade. It's going to be our filter envelope. And we have to work on the envelopes a little bit. So for the VCA envelope, I'm going to make it a little bit towards exponential decay. Just a touch of attack so that we don't have a click. And work on the decay a little bit. As of now, our compressor is bypassed. And then we can utilize the filter envelope, which is going to be a little bit more plucky, a little bit more towards exponential. And then we can introduce some filter cutoff, like that, and then bring this attenuator to introduce some envelope value, right? Nice. Nice and beefy. Nice. And pretty much bassline is done. Let's sequence it, right? So I'm going to go into sequencer. I have some kind of sequence in mind already. So I'm going to go with C on all the triggers over here, and it's going to sound like this. But then I'm going to grab the number 6 and pitch it up a little bit to note G. And the 15th trigger over here to G sharp. Nice. And we pretty much get our bassline going. I think it's a little bit too loud. Yeah, with kick drum it works really well. Nice. And the next thing is compression. And I would like to use our compressor today as more or less like a transient shaper. I would like the transient to be a little bit more louder or punchier and the rest of the body of the signal to be compressed. And for that, we can use the attack at about like 30 milliseconds. It's quite long in compression terms, but we need to pass these transients through first and then compress the signal. So that attack will define how long this punchier transient is. Then we have release at about 50 or so, ratio at about 6:1, threshold at -5, and the gain at 0. We don't really need the makeup gain over here because we can also make it up on the Digitakt or over here. And then we also use the sidechain high-pass filter to high-pass all the low end, so that we do not really trigger the gain reduction envelope with like too much of power of low end. That's quite important actually. So let me engage the compressor and let's have a listen. So when it comes to gain staging here, on the modular, it's quite important to have visual signal or visual representation of what's going on. And that's why I really, really love this compressor from Cosmotronic, because this orange LED underneath the threshold knob actually represents or shows how the gain reduction envelope works. So we can see that it actually works pretty good now and triggers. And the blue signal over here shows the gain basically. We can also warm up the signal a little bit. Maybe, but let's leave it pure. Nice. Another thing which I wanted to show here is that one of the features of Belgrade. So Belgrade is a 2-peak or 2-pole filter. It has these 2 resonant peaks that you can control. And with span, you can basically define the distance in between these two. And in the low-pass filter, this span plays an interesting role. Listen carefully to what happens if I introduce the distance in between 2 poles. Signal pretty much changes to just like a little bit of low end in that signal and removes the high end significantly. With this in mind, I invented the way of ducking. So let's go and grab the output A from Steppy. And maybe we can, yeah, that's fine. we can go into trigger number 4 over here. And from trigger number 4, or envelope number 4, we're going to go into span. Going to make this envelope also quite exponential. And we're going to put 4 triggers where the kick is, like 4 on the floor. You can see that it's triggering on every beat. And then now if we introduce this attenuator and this envelope into the span, we pretty much have the ducking effect. Maybe that's a little too much. Nice. And now if we go and add a little bit of reverb to our bassline, some delay. Let's make reverb longer and darker. And delay, let's make it wide, more feedback. Delay to reverb, and make it actually kind of brighter. And maybe a touch more wide, so that it does not like create this kind of like muddy rumble. We basically high pass it and low pass a little bit, so that like band pass it on the high end. Nice. Maybe a little bit of compression. Nice. I'm using just default settings on the Digitakt and dry mix at 50% or something like that. Nice. Nice. But let's take it even further. So we did not really use the bifold as of now. And I'm going to grab the sine wave from that same Dixie and put it into the input S of the bifold. Let me go back to our keyboard. And basically what we have here is sine wave going into the bifold. And this sine wave is in tune with our square wave because it's taken from that same oscillator. And if I fade into it, we get a different sound. And then we can also play with folding a little bit. Nice. Maybe we can introduce some feedback. Nice. Maybe like that. And bifold, the crossfade goes back to input P, which is our bassline, which is our like square wave or pulse wave. And then we can either add some color by mixing it into, like mixing 2 of the wave shapes. Or we can utilize triggers as well. So I'm gonna go into, again, our Steppy. Steppy is a Swiss Army knife for triggering different things. I'm gonna put a couple of trigs, yeah, something like that, into trig number 2 over here. Let's just leave 1. And the third envelope over here is gonna go into crossfade of that bifold. Nice. So now, whenever like this trigger is happening, it's gonna trigger the envelope, this one. We can make it quite long one, and it's gonna crossfade into the folded version of sine wave and then go back to our square wave or pulse wave. Let's listen to that. Nothing is happening now, but if we introduce a little bit, this attenuator actually passes like the signal. It's a little bit too loud. What if we put a few more triggers here? Or maybe we can go into the edit and say that the probability is going to be 90% or stuff like that. Sometimes it's going to happen, but sometimes not. And we got this interesting variation of our bassline. Need just a little bit of reverb on that clap. Nice. So now it skipped a little bit a few times, which created an interesting variation. Nice. And the next thing that I wanted to show is utilizing the mod wheel of the Digitakt. That's going to be rather a little bit more complicated than the rest. If I take the mod wheel from the Digitakt, like basically the output of mod wheel from here, and put it into the CV input of our VCA over here, and then I go to track number 9, which is our MIDI track, and activate the mod wheel. You can see with this LED that with Digitakt, we can introduce some CV, right? Like that. Now I'm gonna grab another wave from our Dixie, which is gonna be the sawtooth wave, and put it into the input of this VCA, which is the amount is gonna be controlled by mod wheel of the Digitakt, and then put the output into volt per octave of our filter. So it's gonna basically modulate with the sawtooth, the filter cutoff, for the amount of like the mod wheel set here. So now it's clean and all this stuff. And if we introduce a little bit, and then on the Digitakt, we can either do it per step or even utilize the LFO to add some like variety to the bassline. Let's try with an LFO. So I'm gonna go into the LFO destination. It's gonna be our mod wheel. Shape is gonna be a random. Yeah, let's use 1 so that it triggers every single time the sequencer triggers the modular. And just a little bit of depth. No, we have to use the hold actually, sample and hold. So on every trigger is going to generate a random value, not too much, because if we go too much, I mean, depends on your taste, but it might introduce too much of randomness and stuff like that, but just a little bit so that the bassline keeps changing all the time, but not that significantly to introduce complete randomness into it. Now this head didn't land properly. Was an interesting situation when one of the triggers of Steppy did not work, and then it did not crossfade into the folded sine wave, but the Digitakt generated some high voltage for the modulation of the filter with the sawtooth. That's like, this is the happy accidents that you can utilize. One of the ways can be that you can record this sequence for a long time in your DAW and then chop to some interesting like 4-bar loops and stuff like that, and then use for live techno or something on your sampler. Nice. Oh man. If I had more envelopes, I would also put the trigger into the bifold actually, but we can leave it for the next time, right? And we still can see that the bassline is triggering the master over here. I really like the visual representation of what's happening. With the phaser, we can emphasize some interesting frequencies or make bassline even more powerful. I like it. I think that's pretty much it for this video. So this is the bassline in a nutshell. And I think that this is like my favorite way of working on the music, on electronic music. I would go create this kind of bassline and jam hell out of it. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I hope you've learned something interesting for yourself that you can apply to your own music production workflow. There are a couple of ways to support me as an artist and support this channel. First of all, there is a Patreon, and you can check the link in the description down below. Check all these tiers and consider becoming my Patreon. If you're considering to purchase any gear that I feature in my videos or any gear at all, you can use the affiliate links in the description down below. It's gonna help me with some money without extra costs for you. Also consider subscribing to my channel, liking this video and commenting, because that's gonna help the algorithm to push this video to more people. I'm really close to 10K on YouTube, which is amazing. Thank you. And if you would like to watch another patch from scratch video where I did not sequence my modular from the Digitakt, you can check this video, or if you'd like to learn a bit more about bassline techniques on the synthesizers, you can check this video. And until the next time, have fun!